listening to the Metal Command Podcast.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you. And today I am here to talk about an album that, I'm going to be honest with you folks, I sort of overlooked this one. And I'm a little late to the party on this one, but I consider it like my surprise album of the year. Because this was a record that is a lot better than I probably thought it was going to be. When I say that, I didn't think this album was going to be bad, but I definitely didn't anticipate it being as good as it is. And that is the new album by Fifth Angel called When Angels Kill, which came out much earlier in the year. And this is a fantastic album, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson when it comes to Fifth Angel and how I ended up discovering that band back when I started my radio show. But this is definitely a great record. Probably, I believe it's the successor to The Third Secret, which is an album that came out back in 2018. So before I get into this record and I talk about the last one a little bit, let me go back in time to the beginning of my actual radio show back in 1998. So back then, at the end of the show, I always used to have to play, and I've mentioned this before on other podcasts, but I always had to play a public service show before you would sign the station off. That's what we did. Before the station ran like 24/7, that was when it, became automated in that regard, overnight. I used to have to play a public service show. And that show usually lasted a half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. I don't remember how long it was at that point. But when I would be, playing that show, I would go back into the record archives, back into the record library. And there was a lot of old vinyl. Back then, I was a young kid. I was really looking to discover as many really cool heavy metal bands as I could, being in radio. And I would go back to a lot of stuff that was released way back in the day. So I go back and I find this album back there. It's kind of a split 12-inch. And it was a split 12-inch. One side had some songs off of the first self-titled Fifth Angel album. And then the other side was the band Sanctuary, as you know, had songs and of course the Ordain, and that ended up in Jim Shepard, that ended up in Nevermore, but it had songs. The other side of it, you had songs from it was a promo album, by the way, from the first Sanctuary album, Refuge Denied. And so I believe that's what it was. So it was a split album, and it was basically a way for the record company to save a little bit of money. Instead of sending out a full-length album, what they did is they wanted to promote two different bands. And one side had one band, which was Fifth Angel. The other one had Sanctuary. And that way you got songs off of both of those records. And let's say, it was their way to save money because, again, you didn't have streaming, you didn't have electronic press kits, nothing like that. So they had to spend money and press an album, and they had to send it out as a promo. So, instead of sending it, say you send out 1,000 albums or 1,000 records that you had to pay to get pressed for one band, you could put two bands on that and promote both of them and save yourself a little bit of money. And so that's what was back there. So I remember listening to that 12-inch, and that's how I ended up discovering the band Sanctuary, and ended up getting into Nevermore. And that is how I discovered Fifth Angel. And to be honest with you, Fifth Angel, that first album, and then they had another album called Time Will Tell later on. That stuff from the 80s, did I think it was very good? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't bad. I probably would rate both of those albums, actually, maybe a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I mean, there was nothing about them that for me really caught, again, it was well done stuff, but nothing about it really stood out to me to the point where I would go back and be like, hey, these are like some of the most epic classic albums ever. It was good music, but it wasn't anything that had a lot of staying power with me. And those albums were later reissued. I ended up getting them because they are pretty good, don't get me wrong, but they just weren't like, I'm not going to go back and say these are my favorite albums of all time. They're okay records that came out. There were a lot of bands in the 80s and 90s like early 90s that came out and had albums, maybe one or two records, and that's it. So those albums are basically how I discovered the band, and I sort of forgot about them over the last 20 years. So fast forward now to 2018. I open up my email box and I see this email with a, single or a promo. I don't remember what it was now. It was an electronic press kit, and it had stuff off of the a new Fifth Angel album called The Third Secret. Okay. And, I'm like another old school 80s band getting back together, putting out another album. And and there was a trend at the time too, where over the last, 10 years, you were seeing some of these bands that maybe had one or two albums come out, but then they get back together and they put together, a pretty solid effort. Well, I go and listen to this album. It was definitely not what I expected. It was just in your face. It was heavy. I was blown away by The Third Secret, actually. And it was actually a pretty shocking thing to hear Fifth Angel sound the way that they did. They kind of took their sound and brought it up into the modern age. And really, it kind of took me by surprise, actually. But that album was very, very good. And I remember giving that in 2018, I gave that an 8 out of 10. When I did my albums of the year list at the end of the year, I think it was in the top 20. I know that. But it was definitely one of the best albums of that year. So now we come across this record right here, When Angels Kill. Okay. And, I had sort of forgotten, again, you have this thing I call Lost in the Shuffle, where I get so many promos, electronic press kits. I have so many publicists emailing me. And this album kind of came right in the middle of all that. When it showed up in my inbox to listen to the album, I had probably 100 other records that were in there, and each publicist and label and band member, you're going to be getting like 10 emails from each, for each release, because you have all of these record labels just doing these email blitzes, and it gets crazy. So I sort of overlooked this, and I knew it was out, and I went and bought it. But I really didn't pay as much attention to it as I probably should have. Now, if you go on the Facebook page, I did post about this, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. But it definitely was an album that really sort of took me by surprise, because what I expected was that it would be just as good as the last one. I pretty much expected a repeat of the last album. And if you go back and look at the first two Fifth Angel albums, Time Will Tell is kind of like a continuation of the first album. Do I think it's a little better? Yeah. Is it that much better? Not really. I think it's about the same. Again, 6 or 7 out of 10. And if you look at my rating scale, 6 and 7 out of 10 is still pretty good. But that's not where this record went. This record went to a completely different level that I was not expecting, because I think this, as much as I liked the previous album, this one is a lot better. The songwriting is a lot better. The production is better. The whole sound of this band is phenomenal. Now, one of the things that I think that's really cool about this album as well, Jim Dofka does a lot of guitar work in here. He does a lot of the guitar solos. Really cool dude, phenomenal guitar player, great guy overall. But Fifth Angel is one of these, has that old school American power metal sound, which, as I've always told everybody, has a little more of a darker vibe than, say, power metal coming out of Europe. And, there is not a bad song in this record. First of all, there are a lot of songs on this album, but there is not a bad song in this record. It really is that good of an album. And I think, you got 14 songs of just kick-ass, straight-ahead American power metal. You do have some voiceovers and things like that on here as well. But overall, if you're looking at a great album, and again, I'm a little late to the party on this because I just didn't get a chance to listen to it. It happens. It definitely happens. So that's my take on it. I'm giving this album a 9 out of 10. I think, like I said, I gave the last one an 8 out of 10. I'm giving this one a 9 out of 10. It is really that good. So anyhow, check out Fifth Angel. I'll put some I'll put a song in the show notes, a couple links in the show notes to some of their stuff. If you had heard of this band back in the 80s and you wondered what happened to them, in case you don't know, they have 2 albums out now, newer albums out now. I'm going to tell you, folks, it is night and day. If you like those 2 albums from the 80s, you're definitely, I think, most likely you are going to love the last 2 albums they've done out, When Angels Kill, and of course, The Third Secret. So with that being said, that's all I have for you now. I do thank you all for following the show. Hit that subscribe button. If you like this video, hit the like button. Let me know what you think in the comments about the newest Fifth Angel album. Do you like it? Do you like the direction they've taken? If you were somebody that listened to them back, say, way back in the 80s, do you think their new stuff is a lot better? Which, in my opinion, it is. Leave a comment, subscribe, and by the way, thanks for all the support on the Facebook page lately. Definitely, that is also growing quite a bit. So with that said, thanks for watching and stay metal.